Dr. Andrew Walls is our lecturer for this Mission and Evangelism Lectureship, and as was mentioned yesterday, it was established in 1984 in honor of Dr. George W. Peters, who was missionary statesman and professor of missions at DTS from 1961 to 1978. This lectureship gives the seminary community the opportunity to hear missiologists, educators, evangelists, and theologians speak on contemporary issues pertaining to world missions and evangelism. This year we're pleased to have Dr. Walls as our speaker, presenting a series of addresses entitled Landmarks in African Christian History. Dr. Walls is a graduate of the Universities of Aberdeen and Oxford. He began his career as librarian at Tyndale House in Cambridge in 1952. In 1957, he joined the faculty of the Fura Bay College in Sierra Leone, West Africa, as lecturer in theology. And in 1962, he was appointed as the head of the Department of Religion at the University of Nigeria, where he served for a number of years. Then for many years, he was professor of religious studies at the University of Aberdeen, Scotland, before becoming founding director of the Center for the Study of Christianity in Non-Western World at the University of Edinburgh. He's lectured on 6 continents, has been a visiting professor of world Christianity at Yale and Harvard between 1997 and 2001. He was the guest lecturer of Ecumenics and Missions at Princeton Theological Seminary. His recent publications include The Missionary Movement in Christian History, published in 1996, African Christianity in the 1990s, published in 1996, and The Cross-Cultural Process in Christian History, published last year. He currently serves as honorary professor at the University of Edinburgh, and director of the Scottish Institute of Missionary Studies at the University of Aberdeen, and between Edinburgh and Aberdeen, and then in Ghana, at the Akrofi Crystallier Memorial Center, where he teaches every year. He stays busy. It's my privilege to present Dr. Andrew Walls as our speaker again today. Please join me in giving him a warm welcome back to our platform on this occasion.
Thank you, President, and thank you all. As I said yesterday, it's a great honor to stand in this lectureship, a great delight to honor my old friend, Dr. George Peters, and wonderful to enjoy the hospitality and friendship that's been extended to me since I came yesterday. Yesterday, we considered the theme of Africa indigenously Christian, showing how the gospel came to Africa before it came to most of Europe, how Africa played a critical role in early Christianity. And we looked at Anthony, the first African village Christian, of whom we know very much, and some of the ways in which he's a representative figure of African Christianity, using his mother tongue, seeking radical discipleship with perfection as its goal, wrestling in prayer and combating the malign spiritual presences that are so important in the worldview of African villagers. I would dearly have loved to visit other early parts of the African story, to consider, for instance, the shipwreck that made 2 young Christians slaves on the coast of what is today Eritrea, and how they founded a church in the kingdom of Aksum, which became the kernel of the Christian kingdom of Ethiopia, and how the archaeologists of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem have in recent years been revealing how the conversion process went on there, at a time when there were hardly any Christians in my own country. We have not time to consider the astonishing story of the Ethiopian church, or some of its extraordinary evangelists, as I would have wished. I wish we had time for a story which has only been clarified in the last 30 or 40 years, that of the Christian kingdom of Nubia in what we call the Republic of Sudan, a Christian kingdom that lasted nearly 1,000 years, and how the Christian monuments of Nubia have been revealed by archaeologists sent by the communist government of Poland, working in support of the Islamic government of Sudan. Nor have we time to visit the Christian kingdom of Congo in the 16th century, to meet its Bible-reading, preaching king and its strange prophetess and her fight against warmongering and corruption in her country. All these are landmarks of African Christianity that we have to pass by. I have to hurry on to a tale of 3 continents. Between the 16th and the 19th century, the peoples of Europe and America between them broke off a huge piece of Africa and transported it to the Americas. It was Central and South America that began it. The seizure of Africans in small numbers at first to replace the miserable indigenous people in danger of extinction from European diseases and European rapacity in the silver mines. But as European settlement continued and extended across the continents, it established itself in plantation agriculture, and Africa became locked into the Euro-American economy for one commodity, the supply of labor for the Americas. The pattern of trade changed several times over the centuries. At its height, it became triangular, locking Europe, Africa, and America into a single commercial system, building great fortunes, sustaining new industries, bringing new ports and cities into existence, and spawning degradation, cruelty, and misery, producing endemic warfare and violence within Africa itself. There's no need to rehearse to this audience the abominable details or to indicate the unequal apportionment of the prosperity and misery that the system produced. Nor is it my purpose to trace the growth of conscientious Christian protest and attempts inspired by Christian conviction to change what was already a set pattern. Our task is to look at Christian initiatives from Africa and among Africans that were to change the pattern completely. During the Revolutionary War, the British capitalized on the slavery issue. They raised black regiments, mainly as a labor corps, promising those who joined them not only their liberty, but also land taken from their rebel masters. This, of course, was predicated on Britain winning the war. With American victory, and with the peace treaty requiring restitution of property, these former slaves became an embarrassment to the British government. What could be done with them? Numbers were demobilized in colonies that the British still controlled, and the nearest of these were in the Caribbean. The Great Revival had deeply affected the African community in America, and the demobilized soldiers included a number of revival preachers. So far, the revival had not affected the Caribbean as it had affected the mainland colonies. And white planters in the West Indies, terrified of slave revolts, had always been suspicious of any schemes for the spread of Christianity among slaves. Suppose they learnt to read. There had been very little preaching, therefore, on the plantations, and there were no missionaries in Jamaica. One George Lyle, who had been a slave in Georgia and a soldier in the British Army, was one of the demobilized troops who came to Jamaica. A powerful Baptist preacher, people flocked to hear him, and congregations sprang up across the plantations. Lyle decided to use the international network of communication among evangelicals that had sprung out of the revival. He wrote to the Baptist magazine in London, representing how great was the harvest in Jamaica and how he needed help. The result was the arrival in Jamaica of the Baptist Missionary Society. In this case, as so often, missions arrived to assist and sustain an initiative that had been begun by Africans. There was a similar story in Trinidad. Here, too, the first evangelical preaching came from African soldiers, and they preceded Protestant missions by a still longer time than happened in Jamaica. In the Bahamas, which was not a sugar colony, there was a substantial African population which had hardly been touched by Christian preaching until the arrival of the African soldiers brought the gospel there. A great deal of Caribbean Christianity, therefore, owes its origin to the African initiatives from the Americas on which the mission agencies later built. But the effect of the black regiments spread further still. Before George Lyle left Georgia, he pastored a church in Savannah. His assistant pastor was a slave called David George, who also became a loyalist soldier. He was part of a large contingent taken for demobilization to Nova Scotia after the war. At the time they arrived, Nova Scotia was going through a revival of its own. There were new settlers, white as well as black, and an array of powerful preachers. David George became a well-known Baptist preacher, but he was one of many black preachers. Moses Wilkinson, a blind African, was prominent in a Methodist society that made a separate return to the Methodist Conference in London of its black membership. John Morant, an African who had been wounded during service in the British Navy, was in Nova Scotia, having been sent by the evangelical peeress, the Countess of Huntingdon, and he had a chapel of his own. In this way, Africans helped to shape the religious life of the maritime provinces of Canada. At this point, we have to shift the scene back to London, where a group of evangelical parliamentarians and businessmen were combining a campaign to swing public and parliamentary opinion against the slave trade. They wanted a working model of an economic theory that they had. They wanted to demonstrate that African agriculture could be more profitable to all parties than the slave trade, and that free labor more profitable than slave labor. They bought a small piece of land in West Africa to try to prove the point. It was in what is now the Republic of Sierra Leone, on the tiny strip of land which now includes the capital of the country, Freetown. They tried to form a colony in 1787, using destitute black people from the London streets. It broke up in confusion. The sponsors were now looking for new colonists for this anti-slave trade colony. They decided that they'd have to get English people to start it. Then an extraordinary initiative by Africans in Nova Scotia took them on another tack. The black settlers in Nova Scotia were not getting the lands that had been promised to them. One of them, Thomas Peters, volunteered to go to London to plead for justice. He made the hazardous journey, hazardous because if he'd been intercepted he could have been taken back as a slave, met the evangelical philanthropists who took steps to hurry up the land claims in Nova Scotia. But it occurred to both sides that the black loyalists represented by Peters would be ideal colonists for Sierra Leone. An offer was made to any who wanted to come to Sierra Leone of a free passage and land there. The word went round the black churches in Nova Scotia. In the end, 1,131 people sailed for Sierra Leone. David George came and brought his whole Baptist congregation. A Methodist society came with old Moses Wilkinson to the fore. A Huntingdonian congregation was formed too, and in 1792 they marched ashore in Freetown, now denominated the Province of Freedom. And the local story is that they marched ashore singing a hymn by Isaac Watts, "Awake and sing the song of Moses and the Lamb." You see the point? They'd left the house of bondage. They had crossed the Red Sea. They were now in the Promised Land. This is the first Protestant church in tropical Africa. And you'll notice it was not a missionary creation. No missionary was in charge of it for another 20 years, and then only for a very brief period. The first church in tropical Africa came ready-made from Afro-America, with its own congregations, its own preachers, its own leaders. Let me quote from a report of the sponsors for 1795. On Sunday, they abstain entirely from work, dress themselves in very good and some very gay attire, and repair together with their children to church, where their whole deportment during the service and their whole appearance are represented to be such as form a very striking spectacle. They're not only punctual at their worship, but many of them profess in other respects great regard to religion. There are 5 or 6 black preachers among them, raised up from their own body, who have considerable influence. And it's supposed that the discipline which they preserve in their little congregations has contributed materially to the maintenance of the good of the general morals of which we have spoken. There was in Sierra Leone at that time a lady called Mrs. Anna Maria Falconbridge, who was not at all enamored of evangelical religion. This is what she says about the settlers. Among the black settlers, there are 7 religious sects, and each sect has 1 or more preachers attached to it, who alternately preach throughout the night. Indeed, I've never met with, heard, or read of any set of people observing the same appearance of godliness. I do not remember at any time since they first landed and my ever awaking, and I've awoken at every hour of the night without hearing preachings from some quarter or other. The foundation of Sierra Leone was the key event in the Christian history of West Africa in the 19th century. The significance was lost because Sierra Leone never became the prosperous agricultural settlement that its founders planned. It was dogged by disappointments, by false starts, by feelings of betrayal, and above all by the appalling mortality which long gave Sierra Leone the nickname of the white man's grave. But the significance of those 1,131 Africans from Nova Scotia is seen in what happened in after years. The story of how Sierra Leone became a missionary nation I must leave until tomorrow. But in conclusion, we may mention a few more Christian initiatives that came from that abused African population living in the Americas. I spend part of every year in a small town in Ghana called Akropong. The gospel arrived there first in the 1830s through the Basel mission from Switzerland. The king and chiefs welcomed the missionary courteously enough, and they were even interested in the Christian book. But one thing was clear, that they could not accept it. That they had a basic conviction. There was a white man's way and a black man's way. Each was right and valid in itself. God had indeed told the blacks one thing and the whites another. The missionaries did indeed have the book of God, but it was the book for white people. God had given his way to black people. The challenge that faced the Christians in Akropong was, show us black people who say the things that you do. The mission responded by turning to Jamaica. Jamaican Christians appeared in Akropong. Not only so, they confirmed a prophecy that the ancestors of the state had delivered through a diviner when the first missionary appeared, that the newcomers would plant trees. The African Christians from Jamaica planted trees. They planted cocoa. When Ghana achieved its independence in 1957, its economic health was based on the cocoa industry, introduced by African Christians from Jamaica as part of the Christian witness that showed that black people read the book and obeyed the book. Every year I go to Akropong and walk down a street called Hanover Street. It's named for Hanover, Jamaica, because there are the frame houses that the Jamaican missionaries built and lived in. And I worship in the church where they are commemorated. And I see how, even in the succession of their families, they now have become part of Ghana. When I worked in Nigeria in the 1960s, everyone spoke of the Scottish mission from which the Presbyterian Church of Nigeria, centered in Calabar, had originated. Everyone knew it was old established. Quite a few could tell you the date, 1846. But the Scottish mission was in fact not established in Scotland. It was established in spite of Scotland. Its inspiration came from the Presbytery of Jamaica, and its origins lay in the emancipation of slaves in the British dominions, which took place in 1834. It was the Presbytery of Jamaica that set up a mission party that began with ordained missionaries, but Jamaican lay members, some of them African-born, at least one of them born in Calabar. The Presbytery drew up its memorandum for the Scottish Parent Committee to approve, with all the offers of service from Jamaica. The committee slapped them down as presumptuous, insensitive to the leadings of Providence, and imprudent as to the use of money. The mission was established eventually only because Scotland could not prevent it, and over the years its staff continued to come from Jamaica as well as from Scotland, until Nigeria could see to its own ministerial needs. Jamaica had a training institution called Calabar College, which produced many of the evangelists for the great period of expansion, when Scotland was unable to find missionary recruits. There were still some there when I was serving in the 1960s from Jamaica. Afro-America, that part of Africa that Europe and America broke off for their own purposes, had a crucial, indeed a foundational role to play in the history of African Christianity. It's a story that has been largely lost. It had very few famous names in it. But Africans born to suffering in the Americas, identifying themselves as Africans, saw the gospel as a blessing which Africa should enjoy, and slavery as a curse that the gospel could annul. The text which they quoted endlessly was from Psalm 68. Ethiopia shall soon stretch forth its hands unto God. And Ethiopia stood for the whole of Africa. The text showed that Africa had a place in the history of redemption. Perhaps as we begin to experience the amazing reality of the 21st century, of a post-Christian West and a post-Western Christianity, we can see a little more clearly what that place may be.